Good morning. Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Ben Fishman. We're here today to mark the release of my colleague, Sabina Hennenberg, study on Tunisia and civil society. If it's not already in your inboxes, go to the homepage of the Washington Institute.org and click as many times as possible because we need to emphasize the importance of North Africa. The study gets to the heart of how the only state to emerge as a democracy from the so-called Arab Spring has suffered reversals over the last year and a half. One of the key assumptions that was made about Tunisia was the more civil society, the stronger and more diverse it was, the more democracy would be strengthened. Clearly, that has faced some challenges. Of course, this is a complicated story that has many elements, including how Washington should respond to the situation. With us are two distinguished guests, Amy Hawthorne and John Louis Ramon. Amy is the Deputy Director for Research at POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy, a longtime colleague and friend who I turn to anytime I have a question on democracy and governance in the Middle East. And John Louis is beaming in from Tunis, and he directs the North Africa Policy Initiative. We'll go in that order: Sabina, Amy, and John Louis. And first, a couple of rules of the House. After they complete their 5-10-minute presentations, if you'd like to ask panelists any questions during the event, you can use the Zoom function on the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you were tuning in to the broadcast on our website or YouTube, email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. They'll magically appear on my screen, and I will ask the panelists appropriately. So, Sabina, we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Special thanks to the two guests, Amy and Jean-Louis, for agreeing to comment on the paper and be part of today's discussion. And thanks to everyone else from the Institute who has helped put this policy forum together. I'm just going to spend a few minutes kind of outlining the paper and trying to highlight some of the issues that it raises. And first, I'll just mention a few of the kind of motivating factors or the reasons I took on this paper. One of them is just thinking about civil society generally in Tunisia. What does it look like today? How has it changed since we knew it when it emerged as a force with the overthrow of Ben Ali in 2011? And then secondly, and more specifically, and maybe more worryingly, the paper was driven by a desire to get a little bit to this puzzle that Tunisia represents today of the events since July 25th, 2021, having sparked sort of shock and great concern among international observers, donors, and policymakers. But among Tunisians represented by civil society, there was sort of the opposite reaction, either welcoming the events or having more of a mixed reaction. So the study was driven a little bit at trying to get to that puzzle. And then thirdly, looking forward with President Kais Saied now in power in Tunisia and acting essentially as a dictator, what does this mean for US policy, and is civil society sort of an appropriate avenue to direct assistance going forward? The paper is divided into a background section on Tunisian civil society, and then a section overviewing the evolution of civil society since January 2011, and ending with kind of the current challenges facing civil society today. I don't believe this is a group that needs many reminders about the Tunisian context. So I'll just highlight a couple things that the paper raises that I think get to some of the key issues. The first is a reminder about the legal framework governing associational life in Tunisia. Decree Law 88 is the law that governs associational life. It was written in a very liberal way, meaning it gives a lot of freedom to associations to form and to operate. And it's, I think, important and helpful to remember kind of the reasons it ended up being written in this way. That law was adopted in the early months after Ben Ali's flight in 2011. So it was written in an environment of a lot of uncertainty and a certain degree of revolutionary fervor. And so since then, some of the pushback that that law has been met with has been on security grounds. There have been fears expressed that the law allows money to come into the country that funds organizations claiming to be civil society organizations, but that actually have more nefarious agendas, i.e. terrorist agendas. So those are some of the tensions surrounding Decree Law 88. But based on my research, civil society activists in Tunisia, divided as they are on many issues, which the paper discusses, tend to be united in their support for Decree Law 88. And they tend to feel that it extends them the protections that they deserve as associations. In today's environment, they fear that that law could be changed. So that was a big thing I heard while doing my research. And it's still a fear, as I understand. So that was one piece of background I wanted to kind of lay out. And then another is just a reminder about the key moment since 2011 when Tunisian Civil Society has taken the spotlight, and that was with the awarding, of course, of the Nobel Prize to a quartet of organizations for its role in mainly in 2013, facilitating a national dialogue that helped overcome a stalemate and lead to Tunisia's first post-Ben Ali constitution. That stalemate, of course, boiled down to this deep divide in Tunisian life over national identity, with one side feeling that Islam really should serve as an inspiration, including in political life and for national identity, and others feeling that religion has no place in politics, and that political Islam can even represent a threat to national identity. And so I bring up the event of the quartet because I think it really captures what civil society in Tunisia both is and isn't. I think civil society still has the capacity to play that kind of conflict management role, and that national dialogue has been criticized for being an elite dialogue that has excluded or not taken into account the grievances of the Tunisian people more broadly. And civil society certainly hasn't overcome that deep divide between Islamists and secularists. So that was the second piece of background I wanted to put out there. I won't go into the details that the paper does about the evolution of civil society. I'll just, again, highlight a couple things that I think are helpful for this discussion. So first is that the fears of the closing space that I mentioned for civil society, or fears that the legal environment will become more restricted. Just to dispel any kind of misconceptions, from what I heard, that closing space did not begin with July 25th 2021, or even with the election of Kais Saied in fall of 2019. What I heard is that the the application of those laws, or that law, on associational life, even if the law itself didn't change, began to be more restrictive and less tolerant of civil society, beginning in around 2015 or 2016. And of course, 2015 was also sort of a turning point in terms of more like old regime figures coming into positions of power. And then, as everybody knows, since 2015, we've also seen a political class in Tunisia that has been increasingly weak and failing to take on the real needed reforms in the country. So point out that piece about the evolution, that back in 2015-16 was sort of the turning point in terms of this more antagonistic relationship between civil society and the state. And then the second thing is about the great disappointment that that international donors, and people working closely with civil society in Tunisia feel in civil society goes back to that divide over national identity. Because of course, civil society activists tend to identify as secular, and Kais Saied attacks Islamists as part of his sort of sweeping power grabbing moves. And so from what I heard, some internationals fear that civil society activists put their hatred for Islamists ahead of their commitment to democracy. And so that's kind of brings us up to today, and where I'll leave us with these issues or questions. Does civil society really help engender a commitment to democratic principles and tolerance for others the way the theory suggests that it should? If that's not happening in Tunisia, is it just because there hasn't been enough time, or is it another obstacle we should be considering? And what does this mean for US policy going forward and for assistance to civil society specifically? Thanks.
Thank you. And again, the paper goes into details on each of these issues, but there's some weighty questions you asked at the end, and Amy has all the answers. So I'll turn to Amy.
I don't have all the answers. I'm just going to raise more questions. I have a few recommendations that I will talk about. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Sabina and to Ben and to the Institute for inviting me to discuss this really timely and important topic. And at the outset, I want to just acknowledge to all of us and to the audience that we're meeting at an extraordinarily difficult time for Tunisia. The economic crisis is getting worse. There is real suffering among huge numbers of Tunisians. More people, especially young people, are leaving or are planning to leave the country, and there's a growing sense, I think, of desperation. There's also profound disillusionment, anti-politics mood, and incredibly low political and social trust. There is no clear leadership on the economic crisis, and there's a sense of drift, I think, economically and politically, and repression and sort of re-autocratization, if that's a word, are advancing. So against that backdrop, I wanted to reflect on three core questions, three important questions that Sabina's paper raises. And congratulations, Sabina, on your paper. It's a really important reading for all of us. The first question is, should Western donors have been surprised, taken aback, stunned, as many of them were, by the failure of Tunisian civil society to mount an immediate and unified opposition to Kais Saied's July 25th, 2021 power grab? Well, it's important to note at the outset that some human rights and democracy civil society organizations did immediately oppose his moves, recognize them straight away as an attack on Tunisian democracy. And larger numbers of organizations have opposed his anti-democratic moves since then, and especially in recent months. But it is certainly true that in the immediate weeks and months after July 25th, when a strong, unified pushback from civil society could have mattered most, we definitely did not see this. And we don't see it now. Civil society remains divided and fragmented. But we should not have been shocked if we had been paying close attention. Divisions and fragmentation in civil society have been present since the very beginning of the revolution, since the first days, I should clarify, the first days after the Ben Ali regime fell. One divide in particular that Sabina alluded to that has really shaped the response to Kais Said's moves is this divide over Ennahda's presence in the political scene. And this has been a key one. There is a very deep strain of antipathy, a rejection of Ennahda as a legitimate political actor that did not go away after 2013 or 2014. And there has been, over the years, a notable willingness among some civil society actors to support undemocratic measures to weaken Ennahda. Moreover, NGOs and civil society organizations in Tunisia, UGTT aside, because I think we have to put them in a special category, but other parts of civil society, especially NGOs, have in recent years become weaker as a pro-democracy mobilization force. This is something that was already happening before July 25th. And in addition, like everywhere, including in our own country here in the United States, civil society in Tunisia does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of and a reflection of Tunisian society with all of its democratic attributes and accomplishments, as well as its fragmentation, its serious economic crisis that has been going on for more than a decade. And unfortunately, in more and more in recent years, a political class, a political elite that has been unable or unwilling to propose effective solutions to these crises. There have been signs, if you follow the polls, that of growing disillusionment among the Tunisian public with the post-2011 political system and wanting something different. And indeed, Kais Saied won the presidency in 2019 in a landslide, in part with this message. The second question is, have Western donors failed to help build a strong, liberal, pro-democracy civil society? First of all, we do need to acknowledge that certainly there have been civil society assistance programs in Tunisia in the past decade that have not been effective in this regard. We also need to acknowledge that there are some things that donors did well and that there was a positive impact and important support provided. So it's not a black and white picture. And I do take issue with the claim in the paper that the West tried to, quote, create CSOs in Tunisia in their own image. I personally did not see too much of that in Tunisia, some of it, but nowhere near the level that I've witnessed in other countries in the region. So we need to acknowledge where donors went wrong, but we shouldn't overstate or exaggerate or oversimplify the failure. The problem perhaps comes more, or importantly, in some donors' assumptions or expectations about civil society, that it is an inherently liberal or pro-liberal democracy sector or entity, that this is the natural state of civil society, and it just needs aid and training and support to become stronger in this regard. And expecting a pro-democracy civil society to become this incredibly powerful force in Tunisia in only a decade, and somehow not be deeply affected by the broader environment with all of the challenges that I described a few minutes ago. And also we have to acknowledge that, and this is true in every post-democratic revolution country, there is an illiberal or anti-democratic current that has continued to exist in the Tunisian body politic. And that's a current or a strain that exists in many countries, including the United States. So to somehow expect that with a relatively small amount and particular form or type of outside aid, that would enable civil society in the main to overcome challenges identified in the paper, I think is unrealistic. I think there's many more complex dynamics at at work here. And I just want to mention one other donor failure that I think is really important to flag. I think there was a failure, at least in the United States, a failure to grasp how truly serious the political and economic crisis in Tunisia was in the months leading up to Kais Said's power grab. There was a failure to truly understand and respond to the effects of Tunisian democracy's inability to deliver on the demands of the revolution. In particular, a failure by the United States and other donors to push and engage much more vigorously on these issues, in particular corruption. Several years ago, when the circumstances in Tunisia were relatively more favorable to achieve change, donors, at least the United States, in my experience, just did not take the issue of corruption anywhere near seriously enough, and they were much more focused on elections, counterterrorism, et cetera. So that brings me to the third and final question. What should donors, and specifically the United States, do to continue to support Tunisian civil society in this new period, this new environment that Tunisia is in? Continuing support, I believe, is very important, but it needs to be smart. The most important thing that the United States, together with Europe, should do right now is to push back against the repressive laws that profoundly affect civil society. Now, not just against the potential evisceration of Decree 88, but also against things like the recent Decree 54, the truly outrageous cybercrime law that Kais Said decreed last year. These and other laws have a profound effect on the ability of Tunisian civil society to function freely. And donors should not be shy about opposing these things. They need to speak out in support of the universal rights and democratic values, especially of freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, that are universal and that Tunisia itself claims, the Tunisian government claims to uphold, and that many in Tunisia strongly support. Donors should not be and should never be directive of what Tunisians should do, but they should uphold broad universal democratic principles that provide the framework in which Tunisians themselves can figure out the way forward. In doing this, let's be honest, this is not just about issuing an occasional random press statement criticizing one thing or another. This needs consistent diplomatic engagement and a real strategy. It's going to be a long and hard effort for Tunisians to return the country to a democratic path, and it is not inevitable that they will do so. But it is also not inevitable that they will not do so. It is possible, and it's very much worth supporting. But it requires the United States, the Biden administration, to stay the course. There are very deep challenges that Tunisia needs to resolve, but we do have a role, and this starts with a clear and consistent message and strategic engagement from the US together with Europe on these issues, not the confused, muddled, zigzag approach that the Biden administration has pursued, unfortunately, since July 25th. Finally, there is a serious challenge about what to do about civil society assistance, funding for civil society. And this is a dilemma. Kais Said is a leader, the first one actually since the 2011 revolution in Tunisia, who is outspokenly attacking and opposed to foreign funding and critical of civil society. And this indeed is part of his political discourse. It's part of his political strategy. We have not seen this before. Yes, there were problems before July 25th, 2021, which Sabina correctly pointed to, and things that were weakening civil society. But we have to acknowledge that post July 25th, there's been a huge shift in the political environment for civil society, and we cannot disregard the fact that there is a leader who is openly hostile to civil society and foreign funding, at least sort of as he defines it or understands it. So because of this, pouring in too much money, I think we have to acknowledge may provoke the president and give him an excuse to crack down on civil society. Recall the Obama administration's mistakes with democracy funding in Egypt in 2011 and 2012 and the complete mess that caused. With good intentions, but it was ultimately totally misguided to pour tens of millions of dollars into NGO aid in Egypt at that moment. On the other hand, if the US and other donors suddenly pull back and stop providing civil society support because they're worried about Kais Said's reaction, this would be devastating for many civil society organizations. It would be also misguided, and it would empower, I think, Kais Said's dictatorship project by confirming suspicions that the US really doesn't care. It doesn't put its money where its mouth is when it comes to Arab democracy, and that it really has other priorities and is not committed to civil society or democracy in Tunisia. I'll stop there and hand things over to Jean-Louis. Thank you so much.
I think zigzagging is a new policy term we should use more often. Jean-Louis, please, the only person who's in Tunis from this discussion.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Sabina. First of all, congratulations, Sabina, for articulating a rich overview of civil society and its trajectory in Tunisia, its shortcomings, and great series of insightful observations. Thank you for inviting me to comment and discuss, make sense of what's going on, which is pretty complex and not particularly uplifting. I appreciated several insights. One of them that goes beyond just civil society is the role that it played in strengthening local governance and changing popular attitudes. These are often intangible impacts of civil society that do not make it into discussions in the donor community because they are hard to demonstrate, but they do exist, and they do have long-lasting value, and so they should not be forgotten. And you mentioned that, and I appreciated that. Very important also, as was already mentioned, to assess, as you did, civil society against the backdrop of Tunisia's political economic trajectory. If anything, what I would recommend is to look even more closely at the economic dimension, particularly when it comes to the challenges. You covered the important challenges, the closing of the public space. Unfortunately, this is a trend throughout the region. We are currently closing a research and a report with my colleagues at the North African Policy Initiative on the level of civic engagement across 13 countries of the MENA region. And it is basically going backwards everywhere. Societal divisions, as you mentioned also, are particularly important. And here, I echo what Amy said. Civil society is nothing more than the reflection, the articulated reflection of society, and therefore it suffers from the same ills of society, and therefore these divisions affect civil society. I'll come back to it briefly later. The lack of state-society cooperation, I would add also dialogue, that is worth elaborating because it has a very important governance and political repercussion. The insufficient and inequitable distribution of funding and support from international actors also is particularly important, but a very, very large, important obstacle is the impact of economic hardship and insecurity on both civil society and the prospect for democratization. So we could certainly focus on the shortcomings and failures of Tunisia's civil society. And I will actually make a bold statement so that we can just clear that I do believe that most of Tunisia's foremost civil society organizations failed their mission and also betrayed their own values and objectives in many instances. So that said, I will actually focus mostly on our own governments, on Western assistance. And I believe that we suffered from a bit of hubris, the belief that we could change the course of a historical, social, political, and economic trajectory and transition in such a short time with such limited funding compared to budgets of a nation, and again, in such a short time, and also focusing on a single actor, by the way, that is not a unitary actor, as I would mention. So a few observations. The impact of economic hardship. We thought that Tunisia offered great prospects for democratization and better conditions than elsewhere because of the degree of liberty that its citizens enjoyed after the 2011 uprisings that I should say we should not call Arab Spring. But liberty is not enough for the exercise of social political rights, particularly when people are concerned with economic and physical security. And this is something that is already well known, and we can observe it over time. For me, the best at pointing the finger on this were Engelhardt and Welzel, when they noticed this dimension going from survival to self-expression values, survival values trumping self-expression values when people are confronted with hardship. In Tunisia, people have been confronted with a failing economy over the last decade, and a dramatic increase in irregular migration from Tunisia is yet the latest very vivid indicator of this, if there was the need for yet another indicator. But there were a lot of mistakes that we did also, mistakes in the belief of the degree of agency of civil society and the degree of the civic nature. Amy already mentioned it. I will actually reiterate it. I think that we gave too much trust in the power of civil society as a unitary actor and as an actor of change. Civil society is largely epiphenomenal. It is the organized means through which society expresses itself and takes action. And therefore, it is the expression of society. If society is divided, civil society will be divided. But we made a cardinal mistake, in my opinion, thinking that society was a unitary actor, that it could counterbalance the state, whereas civil society actually is mostly different from the state precisely because it's so diverse and not unitary, and therefore not unitary in action. And it ought not to be unitary. And a mistake that we did was to support a liberal vanguard of civil society organizations. So we largely supported, in an inequitable manner, prominent civil society organizations to the detriment of the diversity of civil society organizations across the country. And this inequitable support came against this diversity of civil society, which actually is the key strength of civil society. Is when it's diverse. It's very difficult to repress society when civil society is powerful in its diversity. And this is not novel. Madison actually stressed it very eloquently in the Federalist Papers in the 18th century. And the problem also is that this vanguard civil society that we thought was, and we picked also, being more Western-like and more liberal, in reality showed its shortcomings. So it also was divided and pitted against political Islam, if you will, and trumped its own principles sometimes for convenience. Hence the silence during major downturns of democracy in Tunisia. The excessive focus on organizations also, I think, was a mistake. Civil society is not just CSOs. And we keep on talking about CSOs. Civil society is social movements, it's individuals, it's informal associations that are not registered as CSOs and do not receive funding from international donors. And why is that a problem? Again, it kills diversity, but it also lends to be muzzled much more easily, as it is already happening, let alone if Decree Law 88 is passed, actually amended with a more restrictive legislation. It is much harder to stop widespread individual engagements, much harder to contain diverse forms of engagement, formal and informal, or more fluid. It is useful to observe new forms of political engagements because the space is so closed in the region, not just in Tunisia. We have observed the effective engagement, civic and political engagement of individuals, particularly youth, through other forms. And Sabina, you did mention it in the article. We're talking about social movements, social media activism, but also activism through art, music, theater, graffiti, dance, and other forms. And football ultras in Tunisia, football ultras play a very important role in the dialogue between state and society. Unfortunately, the state has not been able to capture this dimension and continues to repress football ultras when this space has become a space of dialogue between these two dimensions. I'll come to recommendations. I do acknowledge the very valuable recommendations that you made, Sabina, and I would like to build on them. First of all, a reflection. What supports democratic governance? Democratic governance, I would say, rests on 5 elements: a civic political culture, those self-expression values that we mentioned earlier, a civic political culture that is built through practice. Critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills are the ability of citizens to think critically. This is the enlightened citizenry of Thomas Jefferson. The third is a safe and accessible public space. Again, definitely fighting to keep that public space open or providing alternative avenues for the public space, because online activism now is a very potent reality. A fourth is mechanisms to allow for popular engagement and state-society dialogue and cooperation, making sure that there is this cooperation between state and society. And lastly, fostering and encouraging broad civic engagement. So, all to say that I do not believe that now is the time to cut international assistance to Tunisia, as it has already happened between last year and this year. It has been cut by 4, I believe, for the US. I think that now the focus rather should shift, not the support. The support should be equal, if not even greater. It should shift towards the development of these critical and engaged citizens rather than focusing on CSOs. CSOs will naturally emerge out of engaged citizens in the means and through the mechanisms that they see fit in the given environment. And secondly, support state-society dialogue and cooperation, particularly at the local level, which is still, more open and more flexible and fluid and accessible, rather than the central level that is closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. As a reminder, if you have questions you'd like to ask, you can enter them in the Zoom Q&A function if you're on Zoom, or email policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. But I'll first I wanted to get that back to the issue of comparative cases across the region. If we have time at the end, we have about 20 minutes left. Both Amy and Jean-Louis referred to that, the closing of civic space and how to re-engage on that issue, but specifically on Tunisia, and picking off from where you left off in terms of reducing aid, and that's just a reality across budgetary realities in the US, and how we translate aid into policy is something I've been working on myself. Sabina, your paper offers some suggestions about alternative emphasis on how we can use limited resources to support Tunisia, not necessarily civil society. Jean-Louis emphasized more municipal led efforts, or how to get the civic participation for people on the ground. But why don't you elaborate a little bit about your recommendations in terms of specific areas we can focus on as the US government?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. And thanks a lot, Amy and Jean-Louis, for your comments. Actually, your sort of reactions to the paper fit right in with some of the very limited recommendations that the paper offers, and those were developed in feeling very stuck, out of a sense of feeling very stuck about what to do. As Amy raised, we're the US, I guess, and all Western countries who want to support Tunisia face a dilemma in terms of what effects withdrawing completely might have, and what effects doubling down might have. And then both of your remarks get to some of the things that we thought about in developing those recommendations. So one of the big ones was just about to continue to object to or oppose any revisions to Decree Law 88. This is logical because of that support that I mentioned that civil society activists have for Decree Law 88. So not withdrawing, so opposing any changes to Decree Law 88 would help show our support for them. So it's helpful also that Amy pointed out that a recommendation like this should come in the context of more broader strategic thinking in terms of all the things that are happening in Tunisia and how they're all interrelated. And the paper and both of your remarks get into this. What happens in civil society, the challenges it faces are not separate from what's happening in political society and the economic development or lack thereof in the country. And then a second recommendation is about supporting anti-corruption reforms. And if we have time, we could talk in more detail. I would be eager to hear from those who have worked on this kind of programming more than I have, because Amy mentioned that too, that was a big shortcoming of donors in the past, I would say, as Jean-Louis said, along with kind of not paying attention to the flagging economic indicators. So it would be, so the paper proposes focusing on anti-corruption reforms, also because Kais Said's rhetoric is about being the one to kind of turn back all the problems in political society, and so it would be hard for him to oppose this publicly or on the surface. And then a third recommendation, and I'll stop there, is about supporting education in Tunisia. And the reason for this is in part because it's sort of a middle ground, I guess, or an innocuous way to continue assistance for Tunisia without trying to either, as Amy said, be provocative or cut funding entirely. I hope it could be a way to also help even out the coastal interior divisions in Tunisia. We haven't really talked about that, but that continues, that inequality between the interior regions and the coastal regions continues to plague many aspects of Tunisia's democratic development, including civil society. And then Jean-Louis talked about developing these kind of values, things like self-expression and critical thinking, and I think education plays a role in that too. It would, I think, merit a separate, more detailed discussion about what kinds of educational reforms Tunisia needs and how the US can support that. But that was some of the thinking behind those recommendations.
Right. And also Amy mentioned this, and I think it's in your paper about the perceptions of the securitization of our assistance. We've done very important work on police reform and border security, but as Tunisia is becoming a more repressive society again, unfortunately, we either need to evaluate the nature of those programs or reorient them towards other dynamics. Do either of you want to elaborate on some of the issues? We have a question on from online that about the regionalization that Sabina started to answer in terms of coastal versus interior efforts, but also more specifically on how we can address these the issues of corruption and how specifically donors can address these questions about corruption in a meaningful way. So again, I'll start with Amy and then turn to Jean-Louis.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to say, as sort of a clarification, that donors, in case there was any misunderstanding of my remarks, that donors in Tunisia, of course, knew about the economic deterioration. They were very aware of it. They were looking for ways to address it. But I think that not all of them fully grasped the degree to which that economic deterioration and the growing sense of frustration over the lack of economic dignity and social justice, the degree to which that profound phenomenon was affecting Tunisians' attitudes about the democratic transition. In terms of the regional divide, I think this is a really, really important recommendation. And I believe, and I'd be curious to know what the other panelists think, especially Jean-Louis there in Tunis, that this is the donors' sort of imbalance in assistance, failure to truly try to address in a meaningful and at this way and at the scale needed the problem of the interior and deprived regions of Tunisia. I see this as a failure across the board with civil society, but across the full DG, democracy and governance, and sort of economic support portfolios of donors. So it's something that I think should be rectified with future support for civil society, but also with other forms of donor engagement. Ben, I also just want to say something about the securitization of at least the US approach to aiding Tunisia and the real imbalance monetarily in funding for many years, much more significant funding for the security side of Tunisia than the economic and democratic development side. That's a trend that began long ago. There has been some really important counterterrorism assistance to Tunisia that hasn't just been in the US interest, but it's also helped improve security for Tunisians. So we can acknowledge that. But I personally would not include police reform in the list of donor successes or US successes. I think there's actually been a massive failure to address by the US to address effectively the issue of police brutality. So there may have been some reforms within the MOI that the US has helped to bring about that are more on the counterterrorism side. But when it comes to police brutality, which is something that, as we all know, was one of the main grievances that sparked the uprising in December 2010, I think the US has accomplished, sorry to be so blunt, but almost nothing on this front. And they've misunderstood the nature of the problem and how profoundly important it is to a lot of Tunisians, especially people in less well-off areas and especially young people. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Jean-Louis, do you have any reactions?
Well, too many to share, actually, but thank you. I do agree with the points that both Sabina and Amy made. A few of them. So education, by any means, education is probably one, if not the most, one of the most important issues to tackle. And Tunisians know it. They rank it number 2. Our barometer, if you go see the data. We did a whole series with NAPI and also our partners here, thinking about how to tackle education and what are the problems. Problem is that education not only is a kaleidoscope of problems at this point. There is no single silver bullet. It is a plethora of problems that are too many to cite just now. We actually had a roundtable discussion with the Middle East Institute a few months ago, specifically on education in Tunisia. You can go look at that. The other thing is education is huge. There is no way international assistance can redress this kind of issue. This is something that is way beyond the reach of international assistance. We can definitely help steer and point towards right directions and provide alternatives, not just because it helps redress inequality, and I completely agree that it does, but also because of safety issues. It's so bad that it's actually threatening safety of children and also dignity. The conditions are dismal, particularly in some regions of the country. In terms of disparity, though, we have to be very realistic. There is no way to fix the regional disparity in a country like Tunisia as it is in the United States or Italy, where I come from. Italy has suffered from disparities between North and South for centuries, actually since Italian reunification, and it has gone downhill. It's very difficult to address that, particularly now, because it's deeply structural and because it will require anti-economic investments, largely anti-economic investments at a time of economic downturn and large budget deficits. So no way to do that. Local governance, I think we should also acknowledge the few victories, the few successes. There have been programs that have focused on supporting local governance and harnessing youth, giving them space, connecting them to elected officials locally. Inshallah, we will see how local governance goes. But if the link is made between local authorities and the fiber of society, that is extremely powerful. It changes the culture and it changes state-society relations. And it helps participatory and ultimately democratic governance to emerge. The Ma'an project funded by USAID was successful, and I hope will continue to be. Giving youth space at the local level is extremely important. That can also really be something impactful. And it doesn't cost that much to create these physical and virtual spaces for youth to socialize with each other, have some leisure time, and also integrate into the political fabric of society at the local level. So engage with local officials in many ways. And lastly, I would say we need to be more strict and more honest with ourselves with the conditionality of our support. A country that is receiving aid on the condition of doing some reforms to address some of the structural issues and does not do the reforms and continues to receive aid reaches the point where the country is continuing to sink and the money has disappeared to no effect. And Tunisia is here now. And the fact that no IMF support is coming is because there was no large reform done. So aid should also be serious in conditionality, making sure that there is, a bang for the buck, that some reforms are made and that no further restrictive legislation is passed if we do support. Of course, in partnership with the state, finding a common understanding of the benefits of harnessing this youth, because harnessing youth and giving them a space in governance will prevent violent extremism and migration, because they are fed by similar root causes. And the state ought to see that too. So it's a mutual interest.
I'm obviously investing in education is a tremendous project, as you outlined, but you're ended up focusing on youth and some manageable issues that can be addressed. And youth across the region is also investing in youth, minorities, women, etc. Needs to be emphasized. I want to combine two questions from the audience and then hopefully answer them relatively quickly, although they're big questions, and then leave time for a final question. The first relates to democratic culture. The question of is Tunisia, if it has a sufficient base of a democratic culture to succeed. And the second relates to the role of Ennahda in these various developments, whether it was positive or negative. I'm definitely rephrasing the text of the question. So maybe we'll do this in reverse order. Jean-Louis, Amy, and Sabina. And I want to leave open a couple minutes for a general high-level question. Jean-Louis, please. 2 minutes on democracy and Ennahda.
Okay, well, 1 minute each then. First of all, the gentleman asking the question on democratic values is nothing less than a former director of the Tunisian Human Rights League. So thank you for your question. completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, I mentioned it earlier. This is the ultimate pillar, not CSOs. CSOs are not necessarily civic. So we need to focus on fostering this civic political culture, allowing self-expression values to emerge by creating spaces and definitely investing in civic endeavors at the peripheral level, at the local level, at the community level, at the neighborhood level, and focusing on individuals, as I said, because the value will be more resilient, and because organizations will spring out of individual desires to participate in governance. CSOs by themselves do not have inherent value. It's the values that drive them that have inherent value. Sorry, but I'm kind of doing a circular use of value, but I hope you got the point that I wanted to make. In terms of Ennahda, I'll be very swift here. The discussion is completely polarized, although polarized discussions probably echo what you experience these days in the United States. Ennahda is seen as either the great savior or the great culprit of Tunisia's downfall, politically and economically. Personally, as an observer, I only think that they replicated mistakes done by others. They just participated in the game and played by the same rules. Their biggest sin is actually to replicate the same sins, to replicate the same mistakes done by others, hiring more people in the public employment sector, making sure that they would permeate all the areas of power, but just like all the other parties and rulers before and after. So only more of the same, and that's their sin, having led people to believe that they would do different and just doing the same. But we cannot say Ennahda is it is the fault of Ennahda. No, it's the fault of an entire political class and society that needs to really rethink and rebuild its social values and mechanisms for popular participation in governance.
Amy, 30 seconds, probably.
I'll use my 30 seconds to say that Jean-Louis put it better about Ennahda than I ever could, and I think you captured it so well, and I completely agree with what you said, Jean-Louis.
Merci.
Any additional comments on democratic culture?
I have been kind of re-intrigued by that very question too. I think it's really key. Jean-Louis invoked Engelhardt and Welzel, but I think the challenge remains measuring that. How do you measure democratic values? How long should we expect it to take for democratic values to take hold in a way that we can expect democratization when, as everyone on this panel has mentioned, we don't always see that here in the US after, several hundred years.
Finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, how stable is Kais Saied? I'll start with.
How stable is Kais Saied? Not knowing him.
The government.
The government.
That he's created.
I would put it at a 5 now because it's obviously facing a lot of challenges, and those who would need to bring it down are also facing a lot of challenges.
Amy.
The donor community and those outside Tunisia who support Tunisia's stability and return to democratization should be concerned about stability in Tunisia and should have in their minds some dark scenarios about what could happen. Hopefully won't happen, but what could happen if the public or inside the state turns against Kais Saied and decides to replace him with something more repressive.
I'll let you skip the number. Jean-Louis.
Well, as you certainly
final word.
No, I will kindly decline to give you my own number for obvious reasons. But I will say that from what I pick around me, I'm afraid there is not a very long time horizon. Let's put it this way.
Not very long.
No.
Okay. I'll accept that. Thank you, everybody, for joining this great and I think unique discussion in Washington. It only highlights that we need to pay more attention to Tunisia, if not for the dark scenario that Amy hinted at. And please go to the website, download Sabina's paper, and learn about Tunisian civil society and how we should respond from Washington and the rest of the donor community. Thank you very much.